Blood tastes like old pennies and regret. That's the first thing you learn when a kinetic round shears through your ship's hull. The galaxy thought we were dead. A bedtime story meant to scare younglings across a dozen star systems. The bogeymen of the Orion Spur. But we weren't dead. We were just tired, hiding in the dark, licking our wounds. Until the day the sky burned and we realized we couldn't hide anymore. We had to show them why the rumors existed. Vibrations from the tertiary reactor shook the deck plates beneath my worn combat boots. It wasn't a reassuring hum. It was the jagged, arrhythmic shudder of a machine pushed decades past its warranty, grinding its teeth in the dark. I rubbed my thumb over the cracked plastic of my armrest. The bridge of the Aegis smelled like stale coffee, sour adrenaline, and the sharp metallic tang of ozone leaking from the life support scrubbers. We were 50 light years from the nearest human outpost, sitting cloaked in the shadow of a dead moon, watching a massacre unfold. The tactical hololith cast a sickly blue glow across the cramped space. Ghostly icons flickered and died. The alien coalition, the locals called themselves the Conquered, were getting absolutely shredded. Their ships were beautiful, I'll give them that. Sweeping curves, iridescent holes that caught the starlight like spun glass. They fought with lasers that painted the void in elegant, useless streaks of violet and gold. Against them were the Marauders. Brutal, geometric wedges of dark iron that swallowed light and spat out plasma. The Concorde was losing, badly. Sensors show 3 more Conquered frigates just went dark, Caleb, Wyatt muttered. He didn't look away from his console. His voice was flat, but I could see the tension in the corded muscles of his neck. Wyatt was a good sensor operator, mostly because he expected the worst to happen at any given second. He was rarely disappointed. I see it, I replied, shifting my weight. My lower back ached. It always ached these days. Keep the passive arrays tight. We don't want the Marauders noticing our thermal bleed. They're not looking for us, O'Connor said from the helm. She was chewing on the inside of her cheek, a nervous habit that usually preceded something stupidly heroic. They don't even know we exist. Nobody does. To them, we're just ghost stories. She wasn't wrong. Humanity hadn't been seen in this sector for 3 centuries. We'd retreated behind the Veil Nebula after the last war, locking the door and throwing away the key. We became a myth, the ancient, terrifying species that fought with crude kinetics and atomic fire, only to vanish into the deep dark. We liked it that way. It was safe. It was quiet. But sitting here, watching those beautiful, fragile glass ships get broken into splinters, it gnawed at me. We have strict orders, I reminded her, though the words tasted like ash. Observe and report. Do not engage. Do not break stealth. The United Earth Directorate doesn't want another interstellar incident. O'Connor scoffed, the sound barely audible over the rattling air vents. Yeah, let the galaxy burn as long as our backyard stays green. Real noble. I hated that she was right. I hated the sick feeling in my gut. My hands were clammy. I wiped them on my thighs, feeling the rough texture of my surplus fatigues. I didn't want to die out here. I wanted to finish this rotation, go back to Earth, and drink cheap beer until my liver gave out. I wasn't a hero. I was a tired man, commanding a tired crew on a tired ship. Look, Wyatt's voice broke the heavy silence. The Concorde flagship. It's caught in a gravity net. The Marauders are closing in for boarding. I stared at the hololith. The largest glass ship, bleeding atmosphere and venting crystalline dust, was surrounded by 3 brutal iron wedges. They were going to board it. They were going to slaughter everyone inside. I closed my eyes. The ship groaned around me. I thought about the UED brass sitting in their plush, climate-controlled offices, sipping synthetic wine and drafting reports on the socio-political decay of the Outer Rim. I thought about the thousands of aliens on that flagship who were about to have their throats cut because my species decided to play hermit. "Damn it," I whispered. The words were barely a breath, but they sounded like a gunshot on the silent bridge. I opened my eyes. The sickly blue light caught the jagged scar running along my forearm, a souvenir from a boarding action years ago. The phantom pain flared, a sharp prickle of damaged nerves. Before Wyatt could protest further, I raised a hand. "I'm not watching a slaughter today. Not today." The deck beneath us pitched slightly as the ship's internal gyros compensated for the sudden shift in power routing. The Aegis was essentially a massive gun with engines and a life support system strapped to it. When the main magnetic accelerator woke up, you didn't just hear it, you felt it in your teeth. A low, bone-rattling hum began to build, vibrating up through my boots and settling in the center of my chest. It smelled like burning dust. The auxiliary capacitors, dormant for months, were suddenly flushing with raw, unfiltered energy. The air grew heavy, static electricity lifting the hairs on my arms. I hated that feeling. It reminded me of the old colony riots, the smell of charged air right before the pacification turrets opened fire. "Capacitors at 60%, Wyatt reported, his voice tight. The fear was there, palpable in the small space. We were a single stealth frigate taking on a hunter-killer squadron. It was tactical suicide. But the tension in his shoulders had shifted. The dread of inaction was replaced by the cold, sharp terror of impending combat. I unbuckled my crash webbing and stood up. The synthetic fabric of my uniform stuck to my back, damp with cold sweat. I paced the short distance behind the command chairs. "Comms," I barked. "Davis." At the rear console, Davis flinched. He was young, too young for deep space recon. "Sir, get ready to broadcast on all open frequencies. Local Concord and Marauder channels." Davis blinked, his hands trembling slightly as he adjusted his headset. "What's the message, Captain?" I stopped pacing. I looked at the flickering blue projections of the alien ships. They had no idea we were here. They had relegated us to mythology. "No message," I said, my mouth suddenly dry. "Just an identification squawk, old Earth standard, unencrypted." Wyatt let out a low whistle. "They won't be able to read the language, but the encryption keys, they'll recognize the architecture. It's the same signature from the old quarantine beacons." "Exactly," I said. "Let them know the bogeyman is off his leash." The hum of the Mac gun reached a deafening crescendo, shaking the dust from the overhead panels. A stray flake of rust landed on my console. I brushed it away, leaving a smear of red oxidation on my fingertips. "Capacitors at 100%. Shroud dropping in 3, 2, 1. Dropping the stealth shroud felt like stripping naked in a blizzard. The sudden transition from the cozy, invisible void to being the brightest thermal target in the sector made my stomach lurch. The bridge lighting flickered, shifting from the dim, operational red to harsh, unforgiving white as combat protocols took over. The sudden glare made me squint, my eyes watering against the sudden assault. "Active sensors are howling," Wyatt yelled over the din of the cooling pumps. "We just lit up their scopes like a supernova. I'm painting the Marauder dreadnought, the one holding the Concord flagship." "Distance?" I asked, strapping myself violently back into the command chair. The synthetic leather groaned in protest. 40,000 kilometers, point-blank range for the Mac. "O'Connor, align the ship. Give me a firing solution right down their throat." The Aegis moaned, the massive structural spars crying out as O'Connor threw the thrusters into a brutal pivot. Gravity stabilizers lagged for a fraction of a second, and I felt my internal organs slosh against my ribs. Nausea spiked in my throat, tasting like bitter bile and the cheap instant coffee I'd had hours ago. I swallowed it down hard. On the tactical display, the alien fleets froze. It was comical, in a morbid way. For 3 seconds, nobody fired a shot. The lasers stopped. The plasma bursts halted. Every single ship in the sector turned their sensor arrays toward the massive, blooming heat signature that had just materialized out of thin air. "Davis, broadcast the squawk. Now!" A harsh, static-laced burst of ancient telemetry flooded the communication bands. It wasn't a threat. It was a simple, automated handshake protocol from a bygone era. United Earth Directorate Frigate 714. Designation, Aegis. "Concord flagship is hailing us," Davis shouted, pressing a hand to his earpiece. "Audio only. The translation software is struggling. They sound terrified, Captain." "Put it on speakers," I ordered. The bridge filled with a high-pitched, melodic clicking, underlaid by a synthetic, monotone translation. "Unknown vessel. Your energy signature matches forbidden archives. Halt approach. You are violating conquered space. Identify yourself or be fired upon." They were getting slaughtered by the marauders, and they were threatening us. The irony made me let out a short, humorless bark of laughter. "Ignore them," I said. "Wyatt, do we have a lock on the marauder?" "Target locked. They're bringing their point defense weapons online, but they're sluggish. They didn't expect anyone to crash their party." "Fire." I didn't shout it. I didn't need to. The word was a cold, heavy stone dropping into a pond. O'Connor slammed her fist down on the firing stud. The recoil was apocalyptic. The Aegis was designed around the gun, but physics is a cruel mistress. A 3-ton slug of depleted uranium and tungsten was accelerated to a fraction of light speed in the span of 50 meters. The resulting kinetic kickback slammed the ship backward. The inertial dampeners screamed, failing for a terrifying heartbeat. I was thrown against my harnesses so hard the breath left my lungs in a violent rush. My vision grayed out at the edges. The sound was indescribable. Not a boom, but a physical tearing of the air itself, followed by the shrieking protest of stressed titanium. A coffee mug shattered somewhere in the back of the bridge, raining ceramic shrapnel against the bulkhead. When my vision cleared, I was gasping for air, the taste of blood fresh on my tongue where I had bitten my cheek. The bridge smelled like burnt copper and vaporized coolant. "Impact," Wyatt gasped, clutching his ribs. "Direct hit." I looked at the hololith. The Marauder dreadnought didn't explode in a cinematic fireball. Kinetic weapons don't care about pyrotechnics. The tungsten slug struck the jagged iron wedge dead center. It didn't just pierce the armor, it transferred an unfathomable amount of kinetic energy directly into the ship's superstructure. The dreadnought simply shattered. 1 second it was a terrifying, invincible warship. The next, it was a rapidly expanding cloud of twisted metal, flash-frozen atmosphere, and pulverized alien bodies. The sheer shockwave of the impact rattled the nearby conquered ships, their delicate shields flaring bright violet before collapsing entirely. Silence descended on the bridge, save for the ragged breathing of my crew and the relentless hum of the capacitors beginning to recharge. We had just killed thousands of living beings in the blink of an eye. There was no glory in it, no triumphant swelling of music, just the cold, brutal mathematics of mass and velocity. I stared at the expanding debris field on the monitor, feeling hollowed out. a fraud in a uniform, dispensing death because I couldn't stomach doing nothing. "Lord in heaven," Davis whispered, his face pale as a sheet. "The remaining 2 Marauder ships are breaking formation," Wyatt reported, his hands flying across his console. The shock was wearing off, replaced by raw adrenaline. "They're turning toward us, weapons hot, plasma batteries charging. Let them come," I said. The weariness was back, settling deep into my bones. My head throbbed in time with the flashing warning lights on the main console. "O'Connor, bring us about. Give me a rolling evasion pattern. Wyatt, prep the secondary railguns for close quarters." "Captain," Davis interrupted, his voice cracking. "The Concorde flagship. They're sending another transmission. It's unencrypted. They're broadcasting it to their whole fleet." "What are they saying?" I asked, wiping a smear of blood from my chin. Davis swallowed hard. The translator's synthetic voice filled the bridge again, but this time the words carried a weight that made the hairs on my neck stand up. "The myths are true. The demons of Terra have returned. Panic has a specific smell. It's sour, like spoiled milk, and it cuts right through the ozone and recycled air of a sealed bridge." I could smell it on Davis. I could smell it on myself. 2 wedge-shaped Marauder ships were burning hard on an intercept vector. They didn't care about the debris field of their flagship. They didn't care about the conquered frigates scattering like frightened fish. They only cared about us. We had stepped out of the shadows and punched a hole in their god, and now they wanted blood. "Plasma batteries are at maximum yield," Wyatt yelled, his hands a blur over the haptic interfaces. "They're trying to bracket us. 1 high, 1 low. O'Connor," I rasped. My throat felt like it was coated in sand. "Don't let them box us in. Keep our bow pointed at the upper contact. Give me a roll, 30 degrees to port." "Rolling 30 port, aye." O'Connor's voice was tight, stripped of all her usual bravado. The deck tilted violently. The artificial gravity struggled to keep up, creating a sickening sensation of vertigo that made my stomach heave. I clamped my jaw shut, swallowing the bile. Plasma fire isn't like the tight, polite laser beams the Concorde uses. It's ugly. It's essentially weaponized stellar matter, spat out of magnetic containment fields. A glob of superheated plasma streaked past our starboard viewport. It didn't hit us, but it didn't need to. The sheer radiant heat of the projectile overwhelmed the localized thermal shields. The temperature on the bridge spiked instantly. Sweat burst from my pores, stinging my eyes and soaking the collar of my uniform. The plastic casing on the secondary monitors began to warp, emitting a toxic chemical stink that burned my nostrils. "Armor temperature on the starboard flank is critical," Wyatt shouted. "If we take a direct hit, the hull will melt like wax." "Then don't let us take a hit," I snapped back, a little harder than I intended. My chest ached. The adrenaline was starting to curdle into exhaustion. "Where are those secondary railguns, Wyatt?" "Online, targeting the upper Marauder, but their kinetic shielding is angled. If we don't hit them flat, the rounds will just glance off." I stared at the tactical display. The Marauder was a brutal, sharp-edged geometry designed to deflect impacts. They were fighting smart, but they were also accelerating, desperate to close the distance and burn us to cinders. Acceleration means heat. Heat means venting. "Look at their thermal bloom," I said, pointing a trembling, scarred finger at the hololith. "They're running hot. They have to open their exhaust baffles to shed the excess plasma wash." Wyatt's eyes widened, reflecting the harsh, strobing lights of his console. "The baffles are unarmored, but they only open for a fraction of a second." "Then you better not blink," I told him. "O'Connor, Cut the main drive. Hit the retro thrusters. Hard. Sir, that will stall our momentum. Do it. O'Connor slammed the controls. The Aegis screamed, the retros fired, and the sudden deceleration threw me forward against my harness with bone-jarring force. My collarbone protested, a sharp spike of agony shooting up my neck. I gasped, tasting copper again. The sudden stop threw off the Marauders' targeting computers. A massive volley of plasma sailed harmlessly past our bow, leaving a trail of blinding orange static in the void. And just as they passed us, desperately trying to correct their trajectory, the exhaust baffles on their rear thrusters flared open, glowing a furious, unprotected white. Fire! I roared. Wyatt smashed the firing studs. The secondary railguns didn't have the apocalyptic boom of the main Mac gun. They sounded like a massive industrial pneumatic hammer. Thump, 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 thump. Rapid-fire slugs of solid tungsten tore through the vacuum. It wasn't a clean kill. It was butchery. The slugs punched right through the open thermal baffles, bypassing the kinetic armor entirely. They tore into the Marauders' internal engineering bays. One moment, the ship was a terrifying instrument of war. The next, it convulsed. Internal secondary explosions ripped through its hull. Plumes of atmosphere, fuel, and coolant erupted from a dozen jagged gashes. The ship began to spin wildly out of control, a dying, bleeding animal tumbling into the dark. I didn't have time to feel relieved. The harsh blare of the proximity alarm shattered the momentary triumph. "Captain!" Davis shrieked, his voice cracking into a high, terrified register. "The second Marauder! It's beneath us!" I looked down at the tactical display. I had been so focused on the upper ship, I had lost track of the lower one. It had used the plasma barrage and the debris of its sister ship as cover. It was right under our belly. "Shields!" I yelled. A concussive force slammed into the bottom of the Aegis. It felt like a giant had kicked the ship. The deck buckled beneath my boots. The overhead lights shattered, plunging the bridge into darkness, instantly replaced by the blood-red glow of emergency lighting. Sirens wailed, a deafening, mechanical scream. A pipe burst somewhere in the ceiling, spraying freezing, foul-smelling, fire-suppressant foam over the navigation console. O'Connor cursed violently, wiping the chemical sludge from her eyes. "Hull breach in lower decks 3 and 4, Wyatt yelled, coughing through the thick, acrid smoke that was rapidly filling the bridge. "Bulkheads have sealed, but we lost atmospheric pressure in the starboard cargo bay. We have casualties, Caleb. We have casualties." My stomach dropped into an icy void. My crew, my people. I gripped the armrests of my chair, my knuckles turning white. The pain in my back was gone, replaced by a cold, suffocating dread. I had brought them out here. I had broken the rules. "Damage report," I demanded, forcing my voice to remain steady. It sounded hollow, even to me. "Main drive is offline," O'Connor reported, her hands frantically rerouting power systems. "Maneuvering thrusters are barely responding. We're drifting." We were a sitting duck. The remaining Marauder ship was circling us, a shark smelling blood in the water. It didn't fire immediately. It was taking its time, lining up the perfect, fatal shot. It wanted to watch us bleed. Sparks showered from the overhead conduit, raining down on the tactical table and sizzling against the damp, chemically stained floor plates. The bridge of the Aegis looked like a slaughterhouse. Red emergency lights painted everything in harsh, bloody tones. The air was thick with smoke, the sharp smell of electrical fires, and the terrified, ragged breathing of my crew. "Mac gun status?" I asked. My voice was a dry croak. I pressed a hand to my ribs. They hurt, a deep, grinding pain that meant something was broken. "Capacitors are draining," Wyatt coughed, wiping soot from his forehead. "The hit severed the primary power trunk. The gun is dead, Captain." I closed my eyes. The ship groaned, a deep, structural sigh. We were a dead piece of metal floating in the dark. The Marauder was still out there, sitting off our port bow. They were charging their main plasma cannon. I could see the ambient glow of it through the viewport, a sickly gathering orange light that promised absolute incineration. "They're taking their time," Davis whispered. He sounded incredibly young. He was staring at the viewport, his eyes wide and unblinking. "Why don't they just finish it?" "Because they're predators," I said, opening my eyes. The cynicism I usually wore like a shield felt heavy and useless. "Predators like to play with their food." I looked at O'Connor. She was bleeding from a shallow cut above her eyebrow, the blood dripping down and mingling with the chemical foam on her face. She met my gaze. There was no fear there anymore, just a cold, hard anger. "I still have control of the starboard maneuvering thrusters," she said, her voice eerily calm. "I can spin us, put our thickest armor plating between us and that plasma cannon. It might buy us a few seconds." "No," I said. An ugly, desperate idea was taking root in my mind. It was reckless. It was borderline suicidal. But we were already dead. "We don't hide. Wyatt, the Shiva mine in the aft launch bay, does it still have a hardline connection?" Wyatt froze. The Shiva was a tactical nuclear device, a relic from the old wars designed to crack planetary shields. We weren't supposed to have it. I had won it in a poker game with a quartermaster on Mars 3 years ago and kept it hidden in the aft bay for emergencies. "Yes," Wyatt said slowly. "But the launch rails are twisted. We can't eject it." "I don't want to eject it," I said, unbuckling my harness. I stood up, leaning heavily against the console to take the weight off my ribs. "O'Connor, can you use the maneuvering thrusters to throw us into a spin? Not to block them, to point our aft bay directly at them." "If I do that, we have 0 armor facing their gun," she said. "We'll be completely exposed." "Do it," she didn't argue. The deck rumbled as the remaining thrusters fired. The Aegis sluggishly began to turn, presenting our unarmored rear directly to the glowing maw of the Marauder's plasma cannon. "Wyatt," I said, gripping the edge of his console. My hands were shaking. I forced them to stop. "Prime the Shiva. Set the detonation timer for 0. "Captain," Wyatt looked up at me, his face pale. "If we detonate a Shiva-class nuke inside our own bay, the blast wave won't just hit them. The electromagnetic pulse will fry every system on this ship. We'll be blind, deaf, and dead in the water. Life support will fail." "If we don't, we melt," I said flatly. "Prime it." Wyatt swallowed hard. His fingers moved over the keys. "Primed. Dead man switch is active, waiting for your mark." The orange glow in the viewport grew blindingly bright. They were about to fire. "Now!" I screamed. Wyatt slammed the key. There was no sound. In space, a nuclear detonation is a silent, terrifying thing. But the light was absolute. Through the viewport, the void vanished. It was replaced by a pure, searing white flash that burned through my closed eyelids. A shockwave of pure, unleashed radiation and kinetic fury slammed out from the aft of the Aegis. The ship bucked violently, throwing me to the floor. The metal screamed, a high, agonizing sound of tearing steel. Then, total darkness. Every single light, every monitor, every hum of machinery died instantly. The artificial gravity cut out, and I hit the ceiling before crashing back down to the floor as the ship spun wildly out of control. Silence. It was absolute suffocating silence. No ventilators, no computer hum, just the sound of my own ragged breathing, loud and harsh in the tiny dark space. The air was already growing cold. "Report," I managed to say into the blackness. A cough in the dark. "We're blind," Wyatt's voice came from somewhere to my left. "Everything is fried. Backup battery packs are... Give me a second." A faint amber glow flickered to life on O'Connor's console. It was weak, barely enough to cast shadows. "Manual optics only," O'Connor groaned, pulling herself up by the edge of her chair. She peered through the hardened periscope viewer that bypassed the digital systems. I hauled myself up, every muscle screaming in protest. "The Marauder?" O'Connor was silent for a long moment. When she pulled back from the viewer, the amber light caught the utter disbelief on her face. "Gone," she whispered. "The blast wave. We were at point-blank range. It caught them right as they fired. The plasma fed the explosion. There's nothing left but dust." I leaned against the bulkhead, sliding down until I was sitting on the cold deck. We were alive. We were crippled, freezing, and light years from home, but we were alive. "Captain," Davis's voice broke the silence. He had a manual battery-powered radio pressed to his ear. "The Concorde fleet. They're hailing us." "What do they want?" I asked, too tired to care. "They aren't offering help," Davis said, his voice trembling slightly. "They're backing away. They're transmitting a warning to all their colonies." I let out a harsh, dry laugh. It sounded like tearing paper. We had just saved them from total annihilation. We had bled for them, and they were terrified of us. We hadn't just proven the myths true. We had shown them that the monsters were worse than the stories. I pulled a crumpled pack of Old Earth cigarettes from my breast pocket. I stuck one in my mouth and struck a match against the floor plate. The flare of the match illuminated the battered, bloody faces of my crew. I took a deep drag, letting the harsh, synthetic tobacco fill my lungs. "Let them run," I muttered, blowing a stream of smoke into the freezing dead air of the bridge. "We did our job. Frost forms fast when the ambient heaters die." It started on the edges of the viewports, crystalline spider webs creeping across the reinforced glass before migrating to the metal consoles. Every breath I took plumed in the dim, amber light of O'Connor's battery-powered periscope display. My chest screamed with each inhale. At least 2 ribs were cracked, maybe splintered. I couldn't tell. The adrenaline was fading, leaving behind a cold, hollow ache that settled deep in my marrow. Artificial gravity was gone. That was the most disorienting part. Without the familiar pull of the deck plates, the bridge felt like a tomb drifting untethered in the void. A stray globule of blood from O'Connor's forehead floated past my nose, a perfect, grotesque ruby sphere. I swatted it away. It smeared across the back of my glove, sticky and warm, a sharp contrast to the plummeting temperature. "Davis," I rasped. My throat felt like it was lined with rusted razor blades. "Stop staring at the wall. We need manual atmospheric seals closed before the residual heat bleeds out completely." Davis was floating near the comm station, his knees pulled up to his chest. He looked like a frightened child. The radio headset drifted a few inches from his ear, suspended by its coiled wire. He didn't blink. He just stared at the bulkhead, shivering violently. I kicked off the command chair, misjudging my trajectory in the 0G. My shoulder slammed hard against the overhead conduit. Pain flared, hot and sharp, making my vision swim. I swallowed a groan, grabbing a handhold to steady myself, and pulled my way over to the young comms officer. I grabbed his shoulder. His uniform was stiffening with sweat and cold. "Davis, look at me." He blinked, his eyes slowly tracking to my face. "Captain, they left us. We saved them, and they ran." "I know," I said. "Forget them. They don't matter right now. What matters is the temperature dropping, and the fact that we have 2 decks venting into space. I need you to grab the manual cranks. Go to the primary airlock and seal the tertiary bulkheads. Do you understand me?" He stared at me, his jaw trembling. He wasn't processing the words. Panic was a heavy blanket suffocating his rational brain. I didn't have time to be gentle. I didn't have the energy for empathy. I gripped his collar, pulling him close until our visors almost touched. "Listen to me, kid. If you freeze up now, you die. I die. Wyatt and O'Connor die. Do you want to die out here in the dark?" "No," he whispered, a ragged breath escaping his blue lips. "Then move your ass." I shoved him toward the aft hatch. The physical exertion made black spots dance in my peripheral vision. "Go." Davis fumbled for a handhold, awkwardly pulling himself out of the bridge. I watched him go, a sour taste in my mouth. I hated being that guy. I hated the necessity of it. "I've got a visual on the secondary engineering bay," O'Connor called out. Her voice was steady, but I could hear her teeth chattering. She was still glued to the manual optics. "I can see the exterior hull. We have a 50-meter gash along the starboard flank. The armor plating is peeled back like a tin can." "Survivors?" I asked, pulling myself toward the emergency locker mounted on the rear bulkhead. "Can't tell. The area is venting plasma residue. It's a mess out there." I popped the locker open. It was fully stocked, a minor miracle. I grabbed 3 emergency rebreather masks, tossing one to O'Connor and one to Wyatt. "Put these on. The ambient oxygen is going to thin out fast, and the scrubbers are dead. We need to conserve what we have." Wyatt caught his mask clumsily. He looked terrible. His face was pale, smeared with grease and soot, and his eyes were wide and frantic. "Captain, the EMP wiped the core memory of the main reactor. Even if we patch the physical cables, the reactor won't know how to ignite. We are a dead rock. One problem at a time," I said, strapping the rebreather over my face. The rubber smelled like talcum powder and stale plastic. The air tasted metallic and dry. "Right now, we need to check the lower decks. We have crew down there. O'Connor, stay here. Keep your eyes on those optics. If anything moves out there, Marauder, Concorde, or otherwise, you let me know." "Aye, Captain." She slipped her mask on, the plastic fogging instantly with her breath. I nodded to Wyatt. "Grab a heavy-duty flashlight and a pry bar. We're going down." Moving through a dead ship is a sensory nightmare. The silence is the worst part. A starship is supposed to be alive. The thrum of the engines, the hiss of the vents, the subtle vibrations of power flowing through the conduits. Now there was nothing, just the hollow echo of our heavy boots striking metal as we pulled ourselves hand over hand down the central access ladder. The air in the lower corridors was thick. The fire-suppressant foam had frozen into a crusty, yellowed sludge that coated the walls and floor. It smelled like burnt hair and caustic chemicals. We had to navigate by the harsh, narrow beams of our flashlights, the light cutting through the floating debris, shredded insulation, ruined data pads, and things I tried very hard not to look at too closely. We reached the entrance to engineering. The heavy blast doors were sealed shut, scorched black from the heat of the internal explosions. "Help me," I grunted, wedging the pry bar into the narrow gap between the doors. Wyatt grabbed the bar, his hands shaking. We threw our weight against it. For a long moment, nothing happened. The metal groaned in protest. Then, with a sickening shriek of tearing steel, the doors parted just enough for a human body to squeeze through. I pushed myself into the gap. My broken ribs caught on the edge of the door, sending a blinding flash of agony through my chest. I bit down hard on the inside of my cheek, tasting fresh blood, and forced myself through. My flashlight beam cut into the darkness of the engineering bay. What I saw made my stomach drop out completely. Engineering was a slaughterhouse suspended in zero gravity. The primary coolant lines had ruptured, spewing toxic green slush that now floated in jagged frozen chunks throughout the massive cavernous space. The flashlights caught the glint of shattered glass from the monitor banks, hovering like a deadly, stationary snowstorm. "Jesus!" Wyatt breathed over the comms channel built into the rebreather. His voice was trembling violently. I didn't answer. I couldn't. I just swept my light across the wreckage. There were bodies, 3 of them. I recognized the grease-stained overalls of the engineering crew. They were tangled in the heavy securing webs near the auxiliary generator, frozen in unnatural, twisted poses. The pressure wave from the hull breach had caught them before the bulkheads could seal. They hadn't suffered. The vacuum would have taken them instantly. But seeing them like that, floating empty, their expressions locked in a final moment of shock, hit me harder than the physical pain in my chest. "Check for vitals," I ordered, my voice sounding incredibly loud and harsh in my own ears. "Now, Wyatt." He hesitated, staring at the suspended forms. I knew exactly what he was feeling. You don't want to touch the dead in space. It makes it real. It strips away the denial. "Do it," I barked. Wyatt flinched, then pulled himself forward, navigating the floating debris with clumsy, jerky movements. I aimed my light toward the far end of the bay, where the massive, silent bulk of the primary reactor sat dark and useless. A weak, rhythmic tapping sound echoed through the frozen air. I froze. I swept my beam toward the sound. It was coming from behind the heavy shielding of the reactor's diagnostic console. "I've got movement," I said, pushing off a ruined terminal and floating toward the shielding. I rounded the console and found Bennett. He was wedged between the deck plating and the diagnostic mainframe, holding a heavy wrench in his right hand. He was tapping it weakly against the metal pipe above his head. His left leg was pinned under a collapsed support beam, the heavy iron crushing his thigh. Blood had pooled around the injury, freezing into a dark, gruesome halo in the microgravity. His eyes were closed, his breathing shallow and rapid. He didn't have a rebreather mask. "Bennett," I said, grabbing his shoulder. He felt like ice. His eyes fluttered open. They were glassy, unfocused. It took him a few seconds to recognize my face through the plastic mask. "Cap'n," he slurred. His lips were blue. "Got cold real fast." "I know, buddy," I said, my chest tight. I looked at the beam pinning his leg. It was easily a ton of solid iron. Without power to the lifting jacks, I couldn't move it an inch. "We're going to get you out." "No power," he whispered, his head lolling to the side. "Tried to patch the auxiliary lines. Sparked out. Too much damage." "Wyatt," I yelled over the radio. "Get over here. Bring the med kit." Wyatt appeared a moment later, his face gray. "The others are gone, Captain." He looked at Bennett and visibly swallowed hard. He pulled a syringe of coagulant from the kit. "He's pinned," I said, pointing to the beam. "And he's freezing. Inject the coagulant, then give him a broad-spectrum stim. We need his heart rate up, Or he's going to slip into hypothermia. Wyatt nodded, his hand shaking as he pulled the cap off the syringe. He jammed it into Bennett's neck. The engineer barely flinched. "Bennett, listen to me," I said, leaning in close. "You said you tried to patch the auxiliary lines." "Where?" "Panel 4, he mumbled, his eyes drifting shut again. "Red cable, to the blue relay. But the breaker is fused. Need to bypass it manually." I looked up. Panel 4 was heavily damaged, its cover blown clean off, exposing a chaotic nest of charred wires. "If I bypass the breaker, can we get the auxiliary battery online?" I asked, desperation clawing at the edges of my mind. "Maybe," Bennett whispered. "Might start a fire, might blow the relay. Better than freezing in the dark." I left Wyatt to monitor Bennett and pulled myself toward the panel. The wires were stiff with cold. The insulation burned away in several places. My thick gloves made my fingers clumsy. I swore silently, pulling the heavy gloves off with my teeth and letting them float away. The metal of the panel bit into my bare skin, so cold it burned. I found the red cable. It was thick, heavy, and slick with frozen coolant. I traced it to the ruined breaker. I needed to bridge the connection directly to the blue relay, skipping the safety mechanisms entirely. It was a terrible idea. It was the kind of jury-rigging that got ships blown to atoms in space dock. I grabbed a pair of insulated pliers from Wyatt's belt. I gripped the red cable, clamped the pliers down, and pulled with all my strength. My ribs screamed, a blinding white-hot spike of agony that nearly made me black out. I gasped, tasting copper again, but the cable bent. I jammed the exposed copper end of the red cable directly into the blue relay terminal. Sparks showered instantly, bright and vicious, singing the hair on my arms. A loud, aggressive hum vibrated through the metal. I squeezed my eyes shut, expecting the panel to explode in my face. Instead, the amber emergency lights flickered. They died, then surged back, brighter this time. A low, pathetic wheeze echoed through the bay. The life support scrubbers. They were trying to turn over. "Captain!" Wyatt's voice crackled over the radio. It sounded terrified, but not because of the sparks. "What?" I gasped, leaning heavily against the panel, my bare hands numb. "O'Connor just radioed from the bridge," Wyatt said, his eyes wide. "Her passive sensors picked up a massive gravitational displacement, right off our port bow." I stared at him, the cold settling back into my bones. "Marauder reinforcements?" Wyatt shook his head slowly. "No, the signature is too clean, too elegant. It's the Concord." They hadn't run away. They had regrouped. And now, the galaxy's beautiful, terrified people had returned to look upon the monsters that saved them. Spark showered from the jury-rigged relay, casting harsh, stuttering shadows across the engineering bay. My bare hands throbbed with a dull, burning ache, the early signs of frostbite sinking into the skin. I ignored it, pressing my forearm against the icy bulkhead to steady myself as a violent coughing fit seized my chest. Each cough felt like a serrated blade scraping against the inside of my ribs. "Captain," Wyatt repeated, his voice tight with panic. "O'Connor says there are a dozen of them, frigates, heavy cruisers. They're surrounding us." I spat a wad of metallic-tasting saliva onto the deck. It froze almost instantly. I looked down at Bennett. The engineer was barely conscious, his breathing a shallow, ragged rattle. The coagulant had stopped the bleeding, but the heavy iron beam still crushed his leg, and his skin had taken on a terrifying, translucent pallor. If we didn't get him to a med bay with thermal blankets and a bone knitter soon, he was going to die here in the dark. "Stay with him," I told Wyatt, pushing off the bulkhead. The microgravity made my movements awkward and uncoordinated. Keep his mask clear. If his heart rate drops again, hit him with another stim. What are you going to do? Wyatt asked, grabbing the emergency flashlight as it drifted past his shoulder. I'm going to find out if the Concord came back to finish the Marauder's job, or to gawk at the zoo animals. The climb back up the central access shaft was an exercise in pure, concentrated misery. Without gravity, I had to pull my entire body weight upward, using just my arms and shoulders, my boots slipping against the frost-slicked rungs. Every muscle burned. The cold air burned my throat. The pain in my side screamed, demanding that I just let go and drift in the dark. I focused on the rough texture of the metal rungs, the way the frozen fire-suppressant foam crunched under my grip. I forced my mind away from the void outside and zeroed in on the simple, brutal mechanics of putting one hand above the other. When I finally hauled myself through the floor hatch onto the bridge, I collapsed onto the deck plating, gasping for the thin, recycled air the scrubbers were weakly pushing into the room. "You look like hell," O'Connor muttered. She didn't turn away from the manual optics. "Feel like it," I groaned, rolling onto my back and staring at the dark, ruined ceiling. "Report. 12 Concord vessels," she said, her voice eerily calm given the circumstances. They formed a spherical perimeter around us. Distance is holding at 5 kilometers. They aren't powering weapons, but their active sensors are sweeping us so hard my teeth are vibrating. I forced myself up, grabbing the armrest of the command chair. I swayed on my feet, blinking away the dark spots dancing in my vision. "Davis, do we have comms?" Davis was back at his station. He still looked terrified, but the shivering had subsided, replaced by a rigid, white-knuckled focus. "Auxiliary power gave me the short-range tight beam. I can hear them, Captain. They're transmitting on an open loop. Old Earth standard again." "Put it through the headset," I said, stumbling over to my console and grabbing the bulky earpiece. I jammed it over my ear. The melodic clicking of the Concord language filled my ear, immediately followed by the flat, synthetic monotone of the translation software. "Demons of Terra, Vessel Aegis. Your energy signature is fading. Your hull is compromised. Do not attempt to engage engines. Do not attempt to charge kinetic batteries. We are dispatching a shuttle to your airlock." It wasn't a request, it was an order. They were terrified of us, but they also knew we were crippled. They were taking advantage of the wounded beast. "Arrogant bastards," O'Connor spat, catching the bleed over from my earpiece. "They run while we take the hits, and now they want to dictate terms?" "They're scared," I said, wiping a streak of freezing sweat from my forehead. "And scared people do stupid, unpredictable things. Davis, open a channel to their flagship, Tight Beam. Don't let the rest of their fleet hear it." Davis nodded, his fingers dancing across the cracked haptic interface. "Channel open, sir." I leaned over the console, pressing the transmit toggle. "Concord Fleet, this is Captain Caleb of the United Earth Directorate frigate Aegis. You are approaching a sovereign military vessel. We have critical casualties and a compromised reactor. I am authorizing your shuttle to dock, but hear me clearly. If any of your boarding party approaches my engineering deck with weapons drawn, I still have a secondary Shiva mine in the forward magazine. I will crack this sector in half." It was a total bluff. The forward magazine was empty. Even if it wasn't, the firing mechanisms were slagged. But they didn't know that. They only knew we were the bogeymen who just vaporized a marauder dreadnought with a suicide tactic. Silence stretched over the comms. I could hear my own pulse thudding in my ears, a heavy, exhausted rhythm. I looked out the forward viewport. The conquered ships hung in the dark like fragile, glowing ornaments. They were so clean, so untouched by the brutality of the universe they lived in. Finally, the synthetic voice crackled back into my ear. "Acknowledged, Aegis. Our boarding party will remain unarmed. We are bringing medical supplies. Prepare your outer airlock." I cut the channel and let out a long, slow breath. The bluff held. "O'Connor, get down to the primary airlock. Take my sidearm." I unholstered the heavy kinetic pistol from my hip and slid it across the console. It made a dull, heavy scraping sound against the plastic. "Keep it out of sight, but keep the safety off. I'm going to greet our guests." Waiting in the airlock corridor felt like standing inside a freezer. The auxiliary power couldn't push enough heat this far from the bridge, and the ambient temperature was hovering just above freezing. I stood beside the heavy inner blast doors, my arms crossed over my chest to keep my broken ribs tight. My uniform was a mess, stained with oil, soaked in sweat, and stiff with Bennett's frozen blood. I smelled like ozone, cheap tobacco, and desperate violence. O'Connor stood on the opposite side of the door. She looked just as bad. The cut above her eye had clotted into an ugly, dark ridge, and she held her right arm close to her body, her hand hovering inches from the concealed pistol holstered at the small of her back. We didn't look like saviors. We looked like cornered rats. "Cycle complete," the automated mechanical voice of the airlock groaned. It sounded tired, a dying machine forcing itself through one last command. The heavy inner doors hissed, the pressurized seals breaking with a loud, violent pop. A cloud of condensation rolled into the corridor as the warmer, cleaner air of the Concorde shuttle met the freezing sludge of our ship. Through the fog, they appeared. There were 3 of them. They were tall, easily 7 feet, with slender, multi-jointed limbs that made them move with an unsettling, fluid grace. They wore environmental suits that looked like they were spun from iridescent glass and woven light. There were no visible seams, no harsh angles, just sweeping, elegant curves that caught the dim emergency lighting and refracted it in a dozen different colors. They looked like angels walking into an abattoir. The leader stepped forward. Through the clear, crystalline visor of its helmet, I could see a pale, sharply angled face with large, luminous violet eyes. It didn't look at my face. It looked at the blood on my uniform. I saw the creature physically recoil, a subtle tightening of its narrow shoulders. I didn't bow. I didn't offer a hand. I just stared back, letting the heavy, cynical weight of the last 3 hours settle into my posture. "I'm Captain Caleb," I rasped. My voice sounded ugly in the quiet corridor. "Welcome to the Aegis. Mind the mess." The alien reached up and touched a smooth node on its collar. When it spoke, the voice didn't come from a translator box, but directly from the suit's external speakers. The English was flawless, unaccented, and perfectly synthesized. "I am High Arbiter Vale of the Concorde. You are bleeding, Captain." "It's been a long day," I said, shifting my weight. The pain in my ribs flared, but I forced my expression to remain entirely flat. "You said you brought medical supplies. I have a man pinned under a support beam in engineering. He needs heavy lifters and thermal stabilization." Vial tilted their head, an uncanny avian gesture. "Your vessel is destroyed. Your systems are dead. By all tactical logic, you should not have survived the engagement with the Marauder fleet. Yet, you deployed a forbidden atomic weapon at point-blank range and lived." "We're stubborn," O'Connor chimed in from the shadows. Her voice was pure ice. Vial's large violet eyes shifted to her, then back to me. We were taught that humanity was a cautionary tale, a species that burned its own worlds and fought with the savagery of beasts. We thought you destroyed yourselves centuries ago. We almost did, I said. I was tired of the philosophical posturing. Look, Arbiter, we didn't break our isolation to give you a history lesson. We did it because those marauders were going to slaughter your flagship. Now, are you going to help my engineer? Or are we going to stand here analyzing my species' socio-political flaws? One of the other aliens, carrying a sleek, glowing medical case, stepped forward, but Vielle raised a slender, gloved hand to stop them. We will aid your wounded, Vielle said softly. But you must understand our position, Captain. The Concord is built on harmony, on the delicate balance of peace. The violence you unleash today, it is an infection, a brutal, archaic thing. We cannot allow the galaxy to know that the demons of Terra still roam the dark. I felt a cold knot form in my stomach. I looked at Vielle, really looked at them. Behind the luminous eyes and the perfect glass armor, there was a profound, trembling terror. They weren't just afraid of what we could do. They were afraid of what we represented. We were the dirty, bloody reality of survival in a universe that didn't care about harmony. What are you saying? I asked, my voice dropping an octave. O'Connor shifted her stance. I heard the faint, metallic click of a thumb safety disengaging. We will evacuate your surviving crew, Vielle said, their voice perfectly smooth. We will provide medical care, but the Aegis must be left here. It will be reported as destroyed in the crossfire, and you will not return to your United Earth Directorate. You will be placed in a secure, comfortable isolation facility on a conquered fringe world for the safety of the galaxy. They wanted to lock us in a cage, a very clean, very polite cage. I let out a low, dry chuckle. It scraped against my throat, turning into a rough cough. I tasted blood, swallowed it down, and took a step toward the High Arbiter. The alien tensed, stepping back instinctively. You've got it backward, Vielle, I said, leaning in close enough to see my own battered reflection in their pristine visor. You don't get to lock the bogeyman in the closet, not anymore. Fear is a funny thing. You can see it in the way a creature breathes, no matter how alien their biology. Vielle's chest, beneath that iridescent glass armor, was rising and falling too fast. The High Arbiter was used to pressing buttons on a console, ordering sanitized strikes from light years away, or negotiating treaties in climate-controlled spires. They had never stood 2 feet from a bleeding, desperate primate who had absolutely nothing left to lose. You are not in a position to negotiate, Captain, Vielle said. The synthesized voice was still perfectly modulated, but the alien's posture was stiff, defensive. Your ship is dead. Your weapons are offline. My ship is dead, I agreed, my voice a rough sandpaper rasp. But my crew isn't. I didn't give the order. I didn't have to. O'Connor moved with the brutal, unhesitating speed of a trench fighter. She didn't draw the pistol to threaten them. She drew it to end them. The heavy kinetic sidearm cleared her holster, the metal scraping sharply against polymer, and she racked the slide. The sound was deafening in the tight confines of the airlock. It wasn't the elegant hum of a charging laser. It was the ugly, mechanical clack-clack of cold iron chambering a heavy slug of depleted uranium. She pressed the muzzle directly against the center of Vielle's iridescent chest plate. The 2 alien medics flinched, shrinking back against the frosted bulkheads. Vielle froze. The alien didn't try to swat the gun away. They didn't reach for a weapon of their own. They just stared down at the crude, brutal instrument of death pressed against their heart, their large violet eyes wide with an absolute, paralyzing horror. "Kinetic rounds don't care about your energy shields, Arbiter," O'Connor whispered. Her voice was terrifyingly calm. "At this range, this slug will punch through your fancy glass suit, through your chest, and out your spine before you even hear the bang." "This is madness," Vielle stammered, the synthesizer struggling to capture the sudden, chaotic pitch of their voice. "If you murder me, my fleet will vaporize this wreckage. You will all perish." "We were already dead the moment we dropped our stealth shroud," I said, leaning closer. I could smell the air venting from Vielle's suit. It smelled like crushed mint and sterilized snow. It made my stomach turn. "We gave up our lives to save yours. But if you think for 1 second that we're going to let you stuff us into a black site to preserve your political narrative, you haven't been paying attention." I tapped my earpiece. "Davis, status on the emergency squawk." Static crackled in my ear, followed by Davis's voice. It was shaking, but not from fear anymore, from the cold. "Tight beam pulse sent, Captain. Auxiliary battery is completely drained, but the message got out. Slipped it right past their jamming net." I smiled. It was a vicious, bloody pulling of lips over teeth. "Did you hear that, Arbiter? The UED knows we're here. They know what happened, and they know you're sitting right outside our airlock." Vielle's eyes darted from me to O'Connor, then to the heavy pistol pressed against their chest. "You are lying. Your comms are destroyed." "Call my bluff," I whispered. "Pull the trigger on us, Vielle. Vaporize this ship. But ask yourself this. When the United Earth Directorate arrives in 3 days with a dozen dreadnoughts and 100 Shiva mines, are they going to find survivors they can thank? Or are they going to find an irradiated debris field and a conquered fleet with our blood on their hands?" The silence that followed was heavier than the crushing iron beam sitting on Bennett's leg. The cold in the corridor was sinking into my bones, turning my toes numb, sending involuntary shudders up my spine. My ribs throbbed a relentless, sick rhythm. I was running on fumes, standing purely on spite and adrenaline. If Vielle pushed back, if they called the bluff, we were finished. I didn't have a Shiva mine. The UED fleet wasn't coming in 3 days. They might take months to find us. We were entirely alone, but Vielle didn't know that. Vielle only knew the ghost stories. The alien looked at the blood drying on my uniform. They looked at the dark bruise swelling over O'Connor's eye, the sheer, unadulterated grit in her posture. We were the monsters from the dark. Unpredictable, savage, and willing to burn the galaxy down just to keep ourselves warm. Vielle slowly, carefully raised both hands, palms outward, a gesture of surrender that transcended species. "Lower the weapon," Vielle said softly. The synthesizer sounded defeated. "We will not detain you. We will leave our medical supplies and our heavy lifters. You may keep your ship." "You're going to fix my engineer first," I demanded, refusing to let the relief show on my face. "Your medics go down there with Wyatt. They get the beam off his leg, they stabilize his core temperature, and they don't do anything else. You and I are going to sit right here and wait." Vielle lowered their hands, a slow, shuddering breath escaping their lips. "As you command, Captain Caleb. We will aid your wounded." I nodded slowly. "O'Connor, step back, but keep the safety off." She didn't lower the gun, but she took a half step backward, giving the Arbiter room to breathe. The medics scrambled past us, terrified and compliant, rushing down the dark corridors toward the engineering bay. I slid down the bulkhead, my legs finally refusing to hold my weight. I hit the frozen deck plating with a heavy, painful thud, leaning my head back against the icy metal. Vielle remained standing, watching me with a mixture of revulsion and awe. "You are a terrifying breed, human," the Arbiter murmured. "You bleed, you break, your machines are crude and failing, yet you impose your will upon the void." "We just hate losing," I muttered, closing my eyes. The ambient temperature was still freezing, but the deep, existential chill was gone. We had broken the rules. We had shattered the myth. And we had survived. The galaxy thought humanity was a ghost story. But ghosts can't bleed for you. Ghosts can't hold a gun to your chest and demand to be seen. We were flesh, blood, and fractured iron. We were back. And the universe was going to have to make room for us. That wraps up the story of Captain Caleb and the Demons of Terra. If you felt the raw tension of that standoff and loved seeing humanity show the galaxy what grit really looks like, smash that like button and subscribe to the channel for more HFY sci-fi stories. The universe is a cold, unforgiving place, but humanity always brings the fire. Share this video with your friends, leave a comment with your favorite moment from the Aegis's final stand, and keep your eyes on the stars. See you in the next one.